ahead with where you... Actually, you'll have to start over. Start with where you were born, or whatever it was.
Sure. All right. So, hi, I'm Bruce. I'm a fantasy illustrator of landscapes, lots of weird epic landscapes for games such as Slay the Spire and Numenera, which is a tabletop RPG. I grew up in rural Michigan, and I've been drawing since I was a kid. I think most artists will tell you that that's the case. That's how long they've been an artist. I did a lot of fantasy maps back in the day, but transitioned into more and more illustrations. I got a degree in scientific illustration from the University of Michigan, which didn't transition to the entertainment art career that I was looking for. So I headed off to China for 6 years, and then I came back to the US with a plan to make it in entertainment illustration and concept art. And so I've been working on that since about 2012, and I've been a full-time freelance artist pretty much for the last 5 years or so.
Okay. So I will also introduce myself, because I know that not everybody on the stream obviously is familiar with me if you're from Bruce's side of the Patreon. So I'm Katie Croonenberghs. This is kind of the same with Bruce. When you ask yourself like how long you've been an artist, it's kind of like a forever thing. I've always had an interest in art. I kind of knew in a way that I wanted to be an artist growing up, but I also looked into other careers and stuff, but I pretty much always did art no matter what. I ended up going, and I grew up in Missoula, Montana, so a lot of the landscapes and everything around there is what highly influences what I do and my inspiration. When I went to college, I left and I went to college in Denver for a degree in game art and design. Originally I wanted to be a concept artist, but I kind of realized that maybe that wasn't the direction I wanted to go personally. So from there I ended up, it was 2008 I graduated, kind of did a little bit of a floating on the ocean for a bit, ended up in Seattle a few years later, and kind of just did my own thing. I haven't applied to any game studios or companies, but I started doing conventions, and then I ended up basically for the past 4.5 years I've been doing art full-time just as an independent artist based out of Seattle.
Yeah, you've been very successful with conventions, right?
I do it, yes, I guess I would say it is successful because I do it full-time, and conventions are 90% of my income, and that's basically how I make a living. And without that, I don't do freelance or anything, so there's...
Sure, other it's than all riding on the conventions, so they
conventions, yeah, and Patreon a little bit as well, which is still pretty fresh and new, but that will hopefully replace conventions and then online store. But other than that, I haven't actually... I would love to work on book covers, but it hasn't happened yet.
So I'm curious, you're saying that you want to replace conventions more with Patreon. Can you talk a little bit about why you're trying to transition that direction?
Yeah, conventions, they're loads of fun. I love seeing everyone, and they're exciting, but they're also very tiring. And, I can go on pretty extreme, short bursts of, energy that takes me through, between the setup, which is usually on Thursday. It takes about 4 or 5 hours to set my booth up on average. I usually do it by myself. And then Friday, Saturday, Sunday, you're looking at 10 hours of standing on your feet and talking to people, and it's a lot of social interaction. And then a little bit of a crash right afterwards.
True.
So doing that 14 times a year, plus the 1 to 2 weeks of prep it takes for every show, it's a it's a big, like, time suck when you know that you need to also make the art that you sell at the shows. So it's almost counterproductive to be at a show because you're not making art, but you need the art to be at the show.
Right. Yeah, it's a bit of a marathon. I've definitely, since starting to do conventions for the past 3 years now, um, and gradually increasing the number of conventions. I think I did like maybe 3 my first year, 5 last year, and I've got something like 14 on the books for this year, which is just insane. And it's leaving me incredibly tired. I come back and have very little energy, and then of course, as many people in my life know, I've got an infant as well, so I'm taking care of him.
I know,
And
that's
it's
crazy.
just a very exhausting life these days.
Yeah,
So
that
I
is.
totally feel you on that.
I honestly don't know how, because, like, for how tired I am doing, like, conventions all year long, I don't even know how you're doing that and have, like, a little baby.
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of insane because, I mean, and you were saying you don't do a whole lot of freelance, but that's actually like, at least a third of my time spent these days. I'm kind of like 30 hours a week of childcare, and the rest of my time is split between conventions, convention prep, and doing freelance. And then, of course, I try to make a little bit of time in there somehow to do some personal work for Patreon. And kind of like you, I'd like that to grow and be a larger resource so that I'm a little bit less tired.
Yeah.
But we'll see how it goes.
Right, because if you're working a lot of freelance work, then you have a lot of stuff under NDA that you can't even really share with people. So that makes it a lot harder for you to really, like, give everyone a clue on what you're working on when you're like, oh, you can't share it though, right? So.
Right, yeah, if anyone's not familiar with the term, NDA means non-disclosure agreement, and a lot of artists are fighting, or not really fighting, I guess, but laboring under that cloak of secrecy, and it's a really unfortunate thing. You're right. I've been lucky in that maybe about half of my clients haven't been too restrictive with the NDA, and they've been willing to let me share the work, and it can kind of be a win-win situation where I'm obviously promoting what I do, but it also promotes what they do and introduces new fans to their work. But yeah, especially in the last 6 months or so, I've had a number of projects that were under NDA, so I have to wait a while. Thankfully, I've got a bunch of them are announcing right before Gen Con, which is the biggest game convention coming up. So I'll actually be able to share some stuff soon. Here, let me close my window.
Yeah, I was wondering. It sounds like you've got a lot of stuff going on over there.
There's a car revving outside.
It's a very.
I live in a noisy neighborhood.
I know, yeah.
There's a police station a few blocks away. There's a fire station. There's a major hospital. And there's at least one person in the neighboring lot who always likes to rev their car for like half an hour.
Oh, jeez.
And I'm directly above my apartment's area where all the garbage trucks come.
Sounds super relaxing.
Yeah.
Well, closing the window definitely did help. I was wondering because it was
great.
Definitely coming through.
Pretty loud. Hopefully the garbage truck doesn't come in the middle of this.
If it does, I can just mute you. I can mute you really easily now.
Yeah, you might need to just talk about yourself for a while if that happens.
That'd be hard. Okay, so let's see. So I'm looking at, for those of you in the chat, as of right now, if you have any questions, you will not be interrupting us at all. Feel free to ask whatever you want in the chat, because this is your time to have, I wouldn't say I guess one-on-one isn't the right way to phrase that. But it's like, it's a way for you to have us answer you directly. And so if you have any follow-ups, you can ask us, and we can like be really specific about like the answers and everything. So feel free to add your questions in the chat down there. I have a few kind of preloaded general questions, and I loaded ones that I get asked a lot at conventions. Like every single convention, I can like tick off the box, and it'll definitely be filled. But we did both kind of go over how long we've been doing art, which is forever. Yeah, because it's like art's kind of one of those things, at least for us, at least for me, like I can't speak for both of us, but it probably is true for both of us, that when you have a fascination with art, it's kind of what drives you to always do it, and the more you do it, the more you kind of like crave the art, I guess. So I've always been doing it. I mean, I remember finding like old sketchbooks from when I was like 8 and 9 years old, you know, like back when you're a kid and you have to add your name and also for some reason your age to everything. And I think that's like something like our parents teach us. At least my parents were like, oh, put how old you are into everything for later, because a date wouldn't have worked. But I think like I was 8 or 9 when I found the oldest sketchbook that had like the first like dinosaur obsession. I think that might have been like right around when probably 2nd or 3rd grade, I got like super into dinosaurs. And then Jurassic Park came out like not too long after that, and then it was all like dinosaurs and dragons from there on out. So that's pretty early, but you know, obviously we've been drawing for longer than like 8 years old.
Yeah, I think my first drawing that my parents have particularly mentioned was maybe like when I was 3 or 4. They took me to the zoo, and then I came back and I drew a map of it. And so actually growing up, my focus was a lot more on maps per se than illustration. I was just constantly doing maps. Anytime I was sitting in class and didn't want to pay attention, I would turn my sheets over and draw a map on the back side. I think that has actually transitioned into, in part, my interest in landscapes, though, because I think, you know, that's a different way of viewing a landscape. It's a different graphic representation of it, but it's still an obsession with places and the stories that places can tell. And then, of course, on top of that, I've traveled a lot. I've lived around the world. I lived in China, as I mentioned, for 6 years. I lived in Turkey for a bit. I've been to, I don't know, like about 35 countries or so in various parts of the world. And so I often try to take the way I felt about various landscapes that I saw, various places, and imbue that into my work. Of course, I'm also interested in fantasy and science fiction stories because I've always been reading those books and living in those worlds through various forms of media. So I kind of try and bring those two interests together, and that's sort of what forms my work.
I feel like you have a good sense of direction. Is that true?
Yeah, that's fairly true. Every once in a while I'll get lost, but it's pretty rare.
Do you ever like go hiking and you see like some sort of big rock outcropping and you're immediately saying that's like a landmark, and you would like imagine where you are and like coordinated with that rock?
Yeah, I've done some things like that. Actually, my most recent international travel was a little bit of a situation like that. My wife and I were visiting the Mayan ruins of Tikal in Guatemala. And it's this vast ruined city out there, and the central areas they've, you know, groomed and it's all nice and you can't really get lost too well, but the jungles actually go on for like hundreds of miles around there, and if you got lost out there, it would be a pretty bad deal. You could easily get lost and die. However, my wife and I and mostly me, decided that we wanted to go off of one of the trails and try and get close enough that we could spot a howler monkey, which we could hear from quite a distance away.
Yeah, but
So we went well off the trail without any real landmarks except for the howler monkey and my sense of direction in order to get us back to the. So I guess that's indicative of my confidence in my ability to find my way around.
chasing the howler. All right, so we do have a quick question from John Ashcraft here. At cons, how do you feel about having patrons or fans offering to buy you lunch?
I don't think I've ever had a fan offer to buy me lunch, so I don't know how to think about that, to be honest.
It would definitely take me by surprise, I think.
Yeah. That's a new one for me.
Well, for me, at least lately, my convention booths have been growing in size, and unless it's like a really small show, I almost always have a helper with me, or two. Some of the shows I've had up to three, but usually I try to make sure that there's somebody with me, not just because it's actually better and safer to have an assistant at the booth for interacting with customers and everyone who walks up, so that way if I'm busy, then they can talk to somebody, and it's also it helps prevent more theft that happens, which is a thing that we have to watch out for, but also restroom breaks and stuff. I can't just get up and just leave my booth unoccupied, so yeah. I usually have a helper with me, and they get food, or I pack food, so I'm not sure how I'd respond.
I think John's bringing that up because he actually met me recently.
Oh!
So when I was doing Geekcraft PDX down in Portland this weekend, John came by, and John's been nice enough to come by a few times. I saw him at Rose City last year as well. And that particular convention, I didn't have an assistant. And usually I do. Usually, for the reason of it's nice to take bathroom breaks. It's nice to be able to get out and stretch your legs and have someone watch the booth while you're away. It's nice to be able to grab lunch if you didn't. And I think I mentioned at one point that actually, especially that first day, I got in a little bit late and I had rushed to get my booth set up, and so I had grabbed a burger from next door for breakfast, but I basically didn't have anything to eat, and I ran out of water fairly early on, so it was a long, exhausting day at the convention. And he came by and we chatted for a bit, but I think I wasn't really fully there in some respects because I was just kind of tired and hungry.
Yeah, that's definitely one of the hard parts about doing conventions is even running half an hour late, we tend to skip out on food sometimes, which is never a good thing. In the perfect world, I would always have a nice big filling breakfast before every convention that I do every day, and that's just not something that happens as often as it should. So
yeah, I love actually the shows in Portland because there's a Denny's right across the street, and so times when I actually don't have to rush and set up my whole booth and not get breakfast, then I can actually just take my time and do that. But yeah, I guess I would say in that specific circumstance where if it were I'm by myself, then that might actually be
appreciated.
If a fan wanted to contribute in that fashion, it could be nice.
Cool. All right. So there's no other specific questions yet, as far as I can see. But I've got another of those common ones that we get at conventions all the time. At least I do, and that is, where do you get your inspiration? And I think we kind of hit a lot on this because like the way that I see it, and I mean, our inspiration comes from our life experiences and where we've been and who we've met and what we've seen and done. So it totally makes sense that you kind of wrap yourself around travel and like seeing new places and distant worlds and stuff because you've been to so many of them around the world. And for me, growing up in Montana, you know, the landscape there. I grew up in the mountainside, so Montana has like the western half is like mountains, Rockies, and then the eastern half is just like, flat plains. I definitely prefer the mountainside of it. I basically grew up in the trees, so my landscapes usually revolve around mountains. You'll see a lot of lakes and streams and water and pine trees usually, stuff like that. So, I mean, it's just where the inspiration comes from. You look back on the places you've been and the things you've seen, and that's what you're most familiar with, so it makes sense that that's kind of what I draw from. And then with the creature side of things, though, the dragons, that is just more my fascination with, like, the way creatures look. For a little while, I kind of wanted to study, like, ecology and, like, animal evolution and stuff like that. And that wraps up into what I was going to go into for games was concept art. So I wanted to actually be the one to create the creatures and design the creatures and, like, all of that kind of stuff. But because I love dragons so much, I ended up just designing a whole bunch of dragons usually. So that's kind of, like, where that comes from, I guess.
So it's no wonder that you and Crystal Sully are friends.
I know, it's weird how every time I meet another dragon artist, it's just like this instant, like, little, like, click that happens, and we're just like, oh, we love dragons, this is perfect.
Yeah, I guess I would say in addition to the inspiration of you know, real places that I've been to, especially recently, I've been delving into a lot of weird landscapes and things that you could never see anywhere on our planet. And so a lot of the inspiration for that comes from trying to find weird textures and weird objects and things that are pretty normal maybe on a small scale, but if we blew them up and put them into a landscape as the size of a mountain, maybe it would be an entirely different situation. And so, especially for my work with Numenera, since that's Earth a billion years in the future and everything's super weird, I have to look for inspiration in odd places and try to find, you know, textures, maybe look at like the inside of a fruit and think about what a mountain would look like if it had that you know, kind of texture, and, you know, how would people live there? How would they deal with that? So that's a lot of the weirdness that I inject into my art these days.
So for I know you're working on Numenera, and you're also working on kind of your own world, right?
Yes. Yeah, actually, it's a very similar kind of setting, which is why Numenera was such a great fit as a client, because I already was living in that kind of mind space, wondering about what the world would be like, you know, in the far future after our civilization has ended, but not like in the immediate aftermath. People often talk about post-apocalyptic, and they're thinking about, you know, what would it be like living right after the zombie apocalypse, or what would it be like, you know, after a nuclear apocalypse and everything's just ruined. But what I'm often curious about is not the immediate time when people are just struggling, so, you know, to barely survive, but what do the new cities look like? What do the new creatures look like? What do the new plants look like? You know, after things have changed so completely. So the world of the 12 continents is what I'm calling it. And I'm giving myself a lot of room to explore different things. Each area has different thematic elements. As far as my Patreon, I've kind of almost barely scraped into any of that at this point. Um, but I just want to give myself room to explore it and to have characters going around and be able to tell some small stories, some short stories with landscapes as they're wandering around in this world and meeting different groups of not humans, because humans have abandoned and left the world, um, but the sort of the demi-human descendants of humanity are there, and there are different civilizations that they're exploring. And the first short story set in that world is a reimagining of Frankenstein, and Frankenstein's monster in this case is an experiment that has been left behind after humans have left the earth. And so he's sort of railing at his lost creators, and it's kind of an emotional journey that I'm exploring over the course of like 4 or 5 illustrations, and then possibly publishing with some other artists in a collection of reimagined Victorian horror fiction.
Awesome. Sounds like you definitely have a long timeline ahead of you of the plans you've got for this then.
Yes, I purposefully gave myself a long landing strip.
Awesome.
Here, because I just want stuff that I can, dig into, and there's just always more room to dig into it.
Now, I know that in the past, we've talked about, at least you and I just kind of like, obviously off camera, because this is the first time we've done a stream like this, but we've talked about how we want to start including the short stories of each of our pieces on the backs of like our prints at conventions, so that people can have like an insight of what the image is about,
Yeah.
Are you going to have any of your personal pieces, or do you already have any of your personal pieces at conventions where people can read some of these stories now, or is it something that you haven't gotten to yet?
Yeah, I actually do. So I have one of the first personal pieces that was supported by my Patreon. It's If Stone Could Cry. Mm-hmm. And it actually does have like a little kind of, all of these have to be tidbits, because there's only so much you can fit on the back of a print for a convention, and most people don't really want to stand there and read a really long thing anyway. So,
yeah,
there's like about a paragraph.
Yeah, that's a good length too.
Flavor text, I guess you could say, that, maybe hopefully it intrigues people and it makes them interested to experience more of the world. So yeah, I've been including those for the last year or so on the backs of all my prints, and I assume you've also been adding those to yours as well.
Yeah, I kind of retroactively went back and made stories for some of my older pieces, because I know a lot of folks, they kind of ask me like what the story is for a lot of my illustrations, but when I originally made them, I never really had a story in mind for a lot of them. I just like had this vision, and I wanted to like flesh it out. Yeah. I wanted to just make it. A lot of the times I just wanted to make something because I thought it was cool and pretty. But now I guess I'm realizing that I actually do like to write stories, and even if they're just very, very short ones. A story for me is just as short as like a single sentence to, like you said, maybe like a paragraph or two at the very most. And I had a lot of fun with the mermaid piece. So I have the mermaid piece posted on the video so everyone can see there. And this is the one that I recently finished. So the mermaid swimming with the orca, for example, I did not have a story for this in mind when I made it. I just knew I've been wanting to paint an orca, and I wanted to paint a mermaid from Mermay. Mermay, by the way, for those who don't know, is an artist challenge. It's supposed to be a 30-day challenge where you draw, paint, or whatever, you create a mermaid every day during the month of May. And it's supposed to prompt more creativity and get you in the mood for drawing more and just get you to draw more. But I was busy fulfilling a Kickstarter and then also doing conventions, so I basically got nothing done, and I couldn't bring myself to draw for most of the month. So I ended up finishing it this month instead, because I wasn't going to give up on it. But there was no story for it originally, and I knew that, like, I throw out a title. I'm horrible with titles for my paintings, and I end up just using something that's just like some sort of descriptor of it,
Right.
like
Something
dragon on a
general.
rock or something like that. Yeah, like, because I don't know really where it's going. I end up looking back, and it's easier to come up with a title like after it's finished. But on this one, I just called it Orca's Journey. Because it has an orca in it, and they're swimming somewhere, so therefore there's a journey, there's something going on. And I just called it that, and so I just referenced that painting as Orca's Journey the entire time that I was creating it. And then I'm posting it onto Patreon, and my husband walks in, and he's like, and I asked him actually, I was like, hey, what do you think of the title of this piece? It's called Orca's Journey, and he looks at me, and he's like, I don't know, I don't really care about titles too much, but who's Orca? And I'm like, what do you mean, who's Orca? There's the orcas, the killer whales are swimming with the mermaid.
Yeah.
And he's like, well, it says Orca's Journey. Like, it makes it sound like it's, like, is the mermaid named Orca?
Right.
And so from there, I had this idea, I was like, wait, maybe the mermaid is named Orca. And so I had this, like, and the story is posted on Patreon, so I'm sure the ones on my Patreon have already seen this, and when the print comes out, I include the stories in the prints on my website, too, so you can read them there. But basically I was like, okay, well, what if the mermaid's swimming with these orcas, and then there's, like, these scientists or whale watchers or something like that on, like, a boat that's, like, far out on the ocean, and they're playing, like, swimming and chasing fish or whatever, and then they all come up to the surface, and then she hears a human voice shout Orca, like, several times over, and then she starts to think that that's actually her name. She's like, well, it must be my name, I'm Orca. So that's basically the story. It's a very short story, and I absolutely love writing them, but they're not in any way connected to the same world or anything like that. But I think it fulfills my need to create a story without having it anchored in, like, all of these other details that I need to keep straight and everything.
Right. Storytelling doesn't have to be about world building ultimately. Like, I mean, that can be part of it, but doesn't have to be. And certainly there's lots of challenges where people try to tell a story in, like, a sentence, 2 sentences, 6 words sometimes even.
Yeah, I've seen those.
It's absolutely possible to tell a short story, or a super short story like that. I believe they're called vignettes, and so I used to introduce my prints at conventions and say, "Oh, there's a vignette on the back," and my friend Matt, who was helping me, thought that sounded a little bit, I don't know, too elitist or something. You know, he kind of laughed every time I used that. So now I just say I have a story on the back or some short fiction. But people get the idea. Everyone loves to hear stories and tell stories, and you know, I'm also open to the stories that people want to come up with for themselves when they look at my art. But since my art is all original work, and you know, none of it is fan art, you know, things that people are already familiar with, I think it is important to have that story as just another way for people to interact with it and find a connection to it, because they've never seen it before. They have, you know, no hook to something that they've built over time.
Yeah, that's also a good point, too, about having a lot of original work that's not anchored in something that's already familiar. And before I started writing the stories of, like, on my older pieces, I had so many people look at, like, they'll pick a piece up off my table and they'll be like, well, what's the story of this? What is this from? And they'll ask questions, and I'm like, well, I don't know. What do you think it's from? And I mean, a lot of the times I want it to be open-ended. I want I want to have enough elements in there to just suggest what might be going on, because I've found that a lot of people will interpret something very differently. And so it's like this double-edged sword where it's like, well, some people just want to be told a story, and some people like to just fill in the blanks themselves. And so, like, I think including the story on the backs of the piece is obviously, like, a good way to go. But you also, I guess they can just be like, don't read the story if you don't want to have it told to you, because then, they can't, like, fill in the blanks. Because I know that some pieces, they're going to be more personal to someone than they are to someone else. Like, everyone kind of will connect to an art piece differently. And I think that's kind of a big draw to doing original piece over the fan art, is because we can kind of, like, allow people to create those stories in their minds and learn about a new story without being like, oh, well, it's just this character, like, and then that's it. Like, it's just that character. Story's already there. There's nothing really new to interpret from it other than, like, I like this character. Here it is.
Right.
Again, drawn this way.
Yeah. When I consider fan art, I'm not wholly for it or against it. It certainly exists in a gray area, but I think that's often the measure of the difference between what I consider to be good fan art and bad fan art, is how much is the artist bringing to the table.
Yeah.
If they are giving us a different perspective on a character or a story that we've already heard before, then they're offering a lot. If they're just literally, retracing or redrawing the same characters that we've seen before, and not really finding a story moment in that we haven't seen before, then it almost feels like, what's the point?
Yeah, that's an interesting thing about the number of conventions that you and I do. We're submerged in this culture of basically fan art recreation, and there's a lot more original work that gets put out now, which I'm seeing a lot more lately, which makes me very happy, because when you're there, every hour of every day during every convention that you go to, you're just staring at this sea of fan art, and the more you see it, I have this, like, complete disconnect with almost every single piece of fan art that I see now, because there's nothing, like, I wouldn't say there's never anything truly interesting, but usually there's no real, interesting element that's going on other than just a statement of this is a character.
Right.
And so there's nothing to connect
certainly
to.
A lot of the, I guess you could say, a lot of the most common fan art kind of falls into that trap of saying, oh, I've managed to draw a character that I care about. That's enough. And certainly it's nice when they go further than that. I did see that one of your patrons, Renee,
Yeah.
had a question.
Yeah, I was gonna look at that. So everyone's gonna be able to rewatch this video later. I believe that as soon as I stop the video, it will still be active in the link. So I believe people will be able to go back and watch it through this same link, but I'll test it. So they're going to come back.
They should be able to. That's how it works with the One Fantastic Week videos anyway.
Yeah, so that is good. So that way nobody's going to miss a question. I mean, that's the good thing about this chat, is you can just kind of, like, throw your question in there and leave, and you're going to get your answer. Because we'll definitely get to everyone's question here. So yeah, we can dive into that real quick then. Let's see. What advice would you give to someone hoping to get started in an art career, and they're currently busy with a different career?
It's a big question.
It's a very wide question. There's a lot of if this, then this kind of thing going on, because everyone's going to have a very different living situation, and if you have a kid or not, that's going to be a huge, like, factor in everything. Even where you live is going to factor into that, because like living in the Seattle area, you're going to need a lot more, like for example, you're going to need savings. Yeah, you're going to need a lot more income and a lot more saved up if you're going to live in an expensive area like Seattle versus somewhere that's less expensive anywhere but Seattle. What it feels like.
Yeah, I've certainly seen artists that I know of leave places like the San Francisco Bay Area and head to places like Mississippi, where maybe they wouldn't have chosen otherwise. But for an art career, you're not making high tech money, you're not making Amazon money or Boeing money or whatever. So it's pretty difficult to make ends meet, especially at the beginning. Like I feel like art careers are often a little bit like, sending that first little bit of snow down the side of the hill and trusting that it'll eventually become an ice boulder, that has a momentum of its own. And at first it really takes a lot of effort and a lot of belief and a lot of ability to support yourself in the meantime. I guess another thing to say about this is, when you say how to get started in an art career, well, there's a billion and one art careers. Like, they're all different types. There's different industries. Are you wanting to go into gallery, fine art scene? Are you wanting to be an independent artist selling pop culture art at conventions? Are you wanting to work in a studio? Like, you have to decide and figure out what fits your life and what fits your interests. Doing a convention, as we said, is so exhausting. It's not for everyone.
My assistants can attest to that, because some of them have gotten very worn out, where I'm still running around and they're like almost dead on the floor.
and same with going into a studio. Like, some people have a difficult time dealing with being a small cog in a giant corporation, so that's not going to be for everyone either. So there's a lot to it. I think the first step is maybe connecting with artist communities online and being able to ask specific questions about specific problems that you have as you're building up to that. And the second thing I would say is, don't be afraid to have a part-time job as you're building up your art career. Do you have anything of that sort of experience, Katie? Like, you had, I believe you had other sorts of jobs before you started doing this.
Oh yeah. The reason this question is so hard to answer is because every single artist I know arrived to their specific point in time, like whether they're doing art full-time or not. Everyone gets there in a different way. So like one path that might work for someone is like not going to work for someone else, because a lot of it, unfortunately, and I really wish I could give like a step-by-step guide on how this works, but looking back on like my own path to being a full-time artist, it has meandered all over the map. And like I've changed my mind on what I want to do several times, which is fine to do. You just have to understand that if you realize that a direction you're going isn't what you really want to do, that you don't have to start all the way over, but you're kind of starting over again. So a lot of it, like, you're going this way, and then I'm like, oh, actually, like I mentioned before, I was I wanted to be a video game artist, right? So I wanted to do concepts and like maybe matte paintings, or maybe work on like feature films, like the backgrounds and stuff like that, like maybe like what they created in Avatar. But I realized that wasn't an industry that was, first of all, very easy to get into. It was very competitive, but I kind of realized that it wasn't really the direction I wanted to go. So, I'm going up this path, and I'm like, okay, actually, I'm going to change paths. So I kind of had to go back down and then up this way towards whatever else. Like, for a long time, I didn't even know what I wanted to do, so I just worked regular, like I had retail jobs, like sometimes 2 retail jobs at once. And I just did art on the side for like a long time. Like I said, I graduated in 2008, and I worked at like an electronics store, I worked at a game store, I worked at Aaron Brothers for a while. And when we moved to Seattle, the idea was that there'd be more job opportunities here. But I kind of started to just get, I don't know if jaded is the right word, but I realized that I didn't want to work for anyone else anymore. And part of that was my retail experience. Like,
Yeah.
I was put in the position.
Right.
Yeah, I was put in the position of working really hard and it not paying off. And I kind of realized that, like, well, if I'm working for myself, at least what I earn and how successful I become is going to be directly, at least in some way, directly related to how hard I worked. I'm not going to have someone else decide whether or not I get a promotion or I get to do better or, like, you know, get to work in a department that I want to work in. But I personally, you know, couldn't afford to just quit my retail jobs and go full-time art because I still didn't really have a good handle on where I was going at. So what I did instead, I knew I had to get out of retail because it was killing my soul. And I ended up working a contract job at Google. I worked on Google Maps as a debugger. And I actually really liked that job. And that also gave me a lot of experience in project management and quality control, which I then, and this is also important, is like every job is going to give you some sort of skill that you can apply to your art career. So, you know, like for retail, I learned customer service, which is very big if you're going to do conventions, which is partially why maybe conventions were a good fit for me. But I ended up going into office jobs right before I went to art full-time, mostly just because they paid better. Like, I wasn't making a living, I needed to make money. I still did art on the side. Like, I never stopped doing art, so I was still an artist. Like, you're not an artist just because you have another job or another career.
You're never not an artist.
Yeah.
Another thing I always hear people say is, "Oh, I'm an aspiring artist," and I always kind of feel like, well, either none of us are aspiring artists. You know, either we're all just artists, or we're all aspiring because we're all, you know, aspiring to get better and we're aspiring to have better successes. You know, I think you're just an artist at the end of the day.
Yeah.
It's redundant term. So even if you're working a full-time job, if you make art, you're an artist.
Unless
they're part-time art and part-time field or part-time, you know, work in retail and part-time working on your stuff, you know, you're still an artist. Like, it doesn't matter. You just have to do what you have to do to survive and keep on making art, keep on improving, and you'll get more opportunities as you go along.
Exactly. And I mean, if an art career, depending on what you're doing, like, so I can only speak from my own experience, obviously, because it's the only road that I know. And, like, I never felt like less of an artist for working a regular job. Like, if I had it my way, I would have, the last job that I had right before I went full-time art, it was another contract job, and it kind of forced me into full-time art, or else I would have stayed there for another couple of years because it actually paid really well. And I was trying to build up a savings to do, because I knew I was going to jump into full-time art and conventions and everything at some point, but I wanted to have a very large savings, like hopefully enough to get me through a year, even if it was going to be a tight budget, to get me through a year just in case things were a rough start. But because it was a contract job, the contract ended and they basically deleted my position in the company, and I was told that I'd have to start over. And from that point, I was like, oh, well, never mind. I was like, I'm doing this now. But no, like, I mean, I guess I just tried to make sure that, you know, I was making enough income to be comfortable. And I wasn't going to, because I've definitely been in living situations where there's just not not much money. Where like getting a $5 Little Caesars pizza was a treat.
Yeah.
And I just knew I didn't want to go back to that. And, you know, I was working full time and also doing art, building up a print selection for conventions, and also just trying to find a job or working jobs that allowed me to do conventions on the weekend,
Yeah,
so that
that's
I could do them at the same
such a key
time.
thing I find. That was actually a big aspect of the final non-art jobs that I had as well. So after being in China and teaching English over there and doing that all of that, I came back and I taught ESL, English as a second language, here as well. And then I got laid off at one point, and so I was, working, and so I was kind of thrust into doing freelance and trying to fight to get every little scrap, every little client I could. And that wasn't like a terribly wonderful negotiating position to be in.
Yeah.
Basically, being on unemployment and trying to build up a career. And so I actually ended up working at Home Depot for several years as a cashier, and it's not like a particularly, exciting sort of job, right? It's
Yeah.
exactly the sort of retail, job that most people are trying to get out of. But for my purposes, it was actually quite useful for two reasons. The first was that it was very close to where I live, so I was able to minimize my commute and have more time to work on my art when I got home. The second issue is that they were very, very flexible with being able to get time off.
Mm-hmm.
Because I was just one cashier in a huge, very large pool of people, it was no problem to get time off as long as I asked for it, more than like 2 or 3 weeks ahead. And so I was able to schedule and pay for going to conventions, um, not just here in Seattle, but in other parts of the country. I was able to go and do some major workshops. I did the One Fantastic workshop, which is an art business workshop, very useful one. I can definitely recommend that. I did the illustration masterclass um, in Amherst, Massachusetts, which is an amazing opportunity to build technical skills with some of the top fantasy illustrators living today.
So
And I
that's
was
a
able to do all that because of the very humble sort of job that I had, as it turned out.
right. That is a really good point. There is, if you're going to be an artist full time, especially if you're like, it takes money to do everything, unfortunately. And unless you already have that saved up, like, you need some sort of income in order to make, you need money to make money. It's
Yeah,
a horrible line, and it's really obnoxious that it exists, but it's unfortunately extremely true. Like, my convention setup, I didn't start this as big. I used to just have like a regular, like, $40 backdrop with like a $20 banner on it, and I would like tape my prints up there. So, you don't want to start big, because chances are, like, you need to build up to it, but you still have like a
sure.
startup cost no matter what you do. If you're taking art lessons, that's a cost. If you're you have to buy your merch in order to sell it, so that's a base cost. And like, everything costs a little bit of money, and it adds up like drastically. So having that paycheck, whether it's like a weekly or bi-weekly, is a huge boost to make sure that you can actually have a successful business if that's the way you're going, or at least until, if you're applying for a studio, until you can get that studio
Oh
position
yeah,
or
or
whatever it
or
is.
even with freelance, like that also requires investments because you're going to have to meet people. Networking is all about meeting people in person because, obviously we have all the tools to connect with people online, but it's not the same thing. People have more trust and more interest in people that they've actually met and that they've seen how you interact, that you're able to interact in an adult, mature way. Um, so being able to save up money to go someplace like well, even like the workshops that I did, they often had guest art directors from big publishing houses and game studios at those things. going to classes, often the person teaching the class is someone who can connect you to people who you can get jobs from. And all of that costs money, like flying across the country to track down the exact art director that you want to work for costs money.
Right. And also, right, so once you get there too, just to kind of recap this, you can have a good idea about where you want to be, but also be willing to change your idea on where you're going. Because if you meet someone, say you're going, specifically, I want to be a concept artist for games, and then you go to one of these workshops and you meet someone and they offer you a job in a different field that you haven't really heard of or considered, it's sometimes good to consider that as a possibility, because no matter what, it's going to expose you to new contacts, it's going to give you a new experience, and you might actually really like it. So with that, my point being is that you don't have to be on this hard straight arrow to an endpoint. Be willing to adjust your sails once in a while and test different things, because if you don't really know exactly the steps to get somewhere, then it's worth it to explore different areas of art to see what you actually like and what you don't like, and then listen to these contacts. If it's somebody who is well connected and might expose you or get you, I use the word expose, I'll circle back to that, might expose you to some new things.
You used it in the correct way.
Might expose you to some new experiences. And the art world is a huge, it's not just you're an artist, you are an artist in one of these 4,000 categories kind of a thing. Just be willing to adjust your mind, your mindset on what you want to do and how you want to do it. Just so you don't, cut yourself off from an opportunity that might actually work out for you. And then, don't work for exposure. I know that's really hard, because everyone's well, if you're just starting out, you have to do things for free in order to become an artist. And that is totally untrue in every sense of the word, because, the first thing you should really focus on is building your skill as an artist, which is something you can absolutely do working another job. You can go home and you can practice and you can build a portfolio is essentially just a body of work. So just create art, get better at it, become the best possible self that you can be, and then that art will represent you. And if somebody wants you for your art, it means at that point that you're good enough to get paid. You don't have to do it for free, because that means that you're already at a level where they're hey, we could use you. So you also just want to keep that in mind. Don't let people take advantage of you just because you're not well known yet or something.
The thing about exposure, I find, is that anyone worth exposing you probably can afford to pay you.
They can pay you.
Yeah, if someone is trying to get you to do art for free because they basically can't afford to pay you, then who are they going to expose you to? They don't have a working business model for themselves. They don't have a working fan base for themselves. So there's no value in whatever exposure that they can get for you.
Yeah, they can't really help you.
You might as well work on your own projects and expose those projects yourself, and work up until people are offering you more and more money.
Right. And you don't need to work for someone else in order to make a name for yourself. I absolutely want to make that clear, because I'm speaking from experience on this. I haven't done any freelance. I don't have my name on any games or movies or any, I did a couple books for, a self-published author, and that's basically as far as I've gotten. But other than that, it's just going to conventions and meeting people face to face, and being online and being active in the art community and talking to people. And it's all basically just making connections with others that get to know you. because the art community, in a lot of ways, we're very connected. If I jump onto like One Fantastic Week or several other groups online and I make a statement or make a post about something, there's a lot of professional artists, including possibly some art directors. Yeah, a few art directors are on there, I believe.
Some art directors, yes.
So you can put yourselves directly in front of someone else as well and become known, and still do your own thing too. So I just wanted to.
Yeah, I think another little point that I can insert in there is that it's not even just about your body of work. Like, as you're building up your skills and you're getting better technical abilities and you're getting more of a voice and a specialty that you become known for, it's important to interact with the community of artists and art directors and all the people surrounding that, and show what kind of person you are. Like, be a good presence in the community, and that will be noticed and that will be valued. And for example, I can tell you right off the bat that I know for a fact that some of the art directors that I'm friends with or that I work with, they're there in that community, and they're watching and they're seeing how people behave and how people interact. So if you're there and you're participating and you're helping your fellow artists, that can be a huge benefit to your career, just interacting.
Exactly. I've heard many art directors and those in positions of hiring artists that they would rather hire someone who's nice than someone who's good. Like, if you're good, even if you're really good at art, if you're like a complete dick online, they're gonna see that, and that's gonna be very, very bad news for you if you're trying to break into the art world.
Yeah, ultimately they do. I mean, they do need people who are competent, and they look for that. There's certainly enough artists out there that they can insist on that, but the next most important qualification is definitely that you are someone who knows how to behave and how to treat others with respect and communicate and things like that. They are looking at that because that will affect their working relationship, and they don't have time to deal with drama queens.
Yeah. Yeah, and another good thing about joining those groups online isn't just because of those connections, but there's I wish I was in even some of these groups that I am in now back when I first started doing conventions, because when I did conventions, I actually knew no other artists that were doing conventions. I walked into an anime show and I saw people selling artwork, and I'm like, I'm gonna do that. And then the next year I just started figuring it out, and it took a lot to figure out. It took a few years to figure out things that I could just go online now and ask a question, and 15 people would just cascade in with all their experiences and answers. And a lot of that has actually helped me figure out kind of the direction that I'm going to. So just talking with other artists will help in you deciding what's right for you and what's going to work for you as well.
No, there's no need to lament that too bad, because some of those communities have been in the process of building for years now.
Yeah.
And some communities that did exist exploded and fell apart and reformed elsewhere. So, I mean, that's just how it goes. I mean, when I graduated from college in 2005, none of these communities existed. None of it at all. So, yes, I do regret that they weren't there to help me, but I don't regret the fact that I ended up going to China and meeting my wife and traveling to all sorts of very interesting locations that inspire me now. So, it's life. It is the journey. You make the best of it as you go. Do you think we should start wrapping up?
I think we should.
I think we're about the right point.
So we're a tiny bit past an hour, I think.
Yeah, if we're not.
We got started right around 25 after.
Figure out the technical difficulties.
Yeah, that put us back 15, 20 minutes. So one of the questions we will just save for the next one, depending on if it's you or you can. we'll save it for whatever happens.
Whoever else you're talking to on your Patreon.
Yeah,
feed.
I mean, there's a good chance that it might be you again in the future. So, the idea of this stream was basically just to have an artist chat once a month for patrons, and then obviously this if you're watching now, depending on how you found this video, it might be public now. So the stream is recorded live for patrons on a private link, so that anyone in the chat is going to be directly from our patrons, our Patreons.
Yeah.
And then
so
week
they
later,
can ask us questions directly and get feedback immediately. And that's the goal. That's the perk that they get. Of course, we'll be letting people watch the video after the fact, I suppose, and then doing more of these in future with all sorts of other artists.
Yeah, so if you would like to catch the next live chat and be a part of the question and answer stream, this will be available at the $5 and up tiers on both Bruce and I's Patreons, and that is going to be in the description of the video down below, so that you can go down there and you can see our socials, our links to our Patreon, and like other things. So you can sign up there if you want to do that. Otherwise, I highly suggest at least following our patrons, because we are going to post things publicly as well. It's not going to be all just pledge tiers on there. So that way, when there is another stream coming, we can post publicly who's going to be on the stream, when it will be, and then you can decide if you want to sign up to one of the higher tiers so that you can join us live and ask questions in the chat. Is there anything else you want to tell our patrons, Bruce?
No, I think you covered it pretty well, and I'm going to be doing the same as you. It'll be available in future for $5 and up patrons to have the live Q&A, and I'll be looking to have interesting conversations with a variety of other people, including other artists, maybe even some art directors or other creatives who aren't in fantasy illustration but have inspired what I do in some way, in some fashion. Hopefully get a lot of interesting people to talk to. So I'm looking forward to it.
And you might have both Bruce and I again. Cool. Okay, so we're going to wrap that up. And of course, this stream is only possible because of our patrons. And so that's why we're kind of doing this, is we both reached 100 pages where we just kind of wanted to give back to our community a little bit more. And I know that I always like talking to other artists, and I like to learn from other artists, because everyone's got a different viewpoint on everything. And I think it's fascinating to hear the journeys and opinions that other artists have, because that's kind of like how you make informed decisions and just learn about what it's like in this crazy, unpredictable career that we've chosen for some reason. All right, so I'm going to end it and then see if I can edit out that huge swath in the beginning where I couldn't get my image to show. So thank you, everyone, for joining, and we'll see you next time, I guess.
Until next time.